Okay, it's 8:30. Welcome everyone. As you start to trickle in, I don't actually see how many people are here yet, but in my imagination, many people are joining us at this moment. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes before we introduce our wonderful panelists this morning. So get situated, grab some coffee or whatever it is that you need in this moment. And yeah, we'll start in just a couple of minutes, but welcome. Day 4. As you come into the space, if you want to introduce yourselves in the chat bar, that'd be great. Thanks for joining. Let us know where you're joining us from this morning. Note that in the chat bar, the default is just to send a message to the panelists, but if you you can press it's like the blue thing to change it so that your chat goes to everyone. Welcome. I see more people joining us. Come on in. Come on in to your screen. Okay, well, it's 8:32, so I think we're going to start. I think we're going to get going. I already scanned 2 slides ahead. Hi, everyone. I'm Vicky Clarke. I'm the Policy Director with Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bike, so use she, her pronouns. I want to welcome you to the Washington Bike Walk and Roll Summit presented by Amazon. We're really excited to have over 600 registrants for this 5-day virtual event. And we'd like to start this session with a land acknowledgement. This summit is virtual and those participating are joining us from many lands. We acknowledge the land that Cascade Bicycle Club sits on today as the traditional home of the Duwamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and Suquamish tribal nations. If you don't know whose land you're on, look in the chat in a minute where you'll find a link to a map and you can look up your place on the land. Without them, we would not have access to this environment. We take the opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land who are still here. I would also like to note that we're recording this session and all the sessions during the week will be available online after the summit. So with that, the summit is hosted by Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes, 2 sister statewide organizations with a shared vision of bicycling for all. Cascade serves riders of all ages and abilities throughout Washington state, educating new riders, advocating for safe places to bike, and holding events and rides. Washington Bikes advocates for bicyclist rights, endorses political candidates, holds officials accountable, and works to shape policies that will make bicycling safe and accessible for all. We also want to take a second to thank our sponsors. I skipped a bit. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, Amazon. We want to take this moment to thank our sponsors whose collective contributions have enabled us to bring together 15 panels with expert speakers and registration free for all attendees. We also want to thank our supporting sponsors, the Washington State Department of Transportation Active Transportation Division and Eastern Washington Region. Thanks to our general sponsors, the U.S. Department of Transportation Federal Highway Administration and Stacey Bain Bike Lawyers. So with that, and before we transition to introducing this summit session, we'd like to take a moment to articulate the community expectations we have for all the summit sessions. We will maintain a standard of conduct to ensure that all participants feel safe and respected. We believe every person has the right to be treated with dignity and respect and to be free from all forms of harassment. And so we ask all attendees to be fully present in this session, to be self-responsible and self-challenging, to listen and process, suspend judgment of yourself and others, use respectful language towards others and the panel. And so also, if you have any questions or concerns during the session, please feel free to reach out to the chat monitors through the personal message feature on the chat bar. Ooh. Now I want to really quickly introduce the session, Evolution in the Bike Community, a conversation with organizational leaders. And I want to introduce Amy Johnson, who's with the Palmetto Cycling Coalition, Eli Akira Kaufman, who's with the Los Angeles County Bike Coalition, big name, and Brian Weidenmeyer, who's with the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition. And really want to start by sort of setting the scene a little bit and asking each of the panelists, I'm going to stop sharing, to share a little bit about themselves and the organization that they're here representing today. And so first I want to start with Amy.
Hi, thanks for the invite, all the way on the other side of the country. So, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thanks. So, I'm the director of Palmetto Cycling Coalition. We're the statewide focus. We're the statewide bike and walk safety organization for South Carolina. Every statewide entity in our state always starts with Palmetto. It's the state tree. That's where that came from. But so I've been in this position for over 8 years so far, and previously worked for Bike Athens in Athens, Georgia, one state over, which is pretty close to Atlanta. It's the flagship university institution there. And so did a lot of volunteer work before that, and previously my professional experience previous to advocacy was in teaching and environmental regulation. So so our organization, we focus on safety and access and education. That's historically what we've worked with. But there are local organizations within South Carolina also advocating for similar things, from directly focused locally on biking and walking to also health focused, but including active transportation, some livable communities, environmental organizations. There's a lot of overlap with the mission at the local level, but we remain focused at the state level because not a lot of other folks at the state level are. And so we work within legislation and then also state agency advocacy.
Great. Thanks, Amy. And how big is your staff? Just
right now, just me. Okay. I'm working to get that budget back up to a healthy spot so I can hire a second person comfortably. But we have historically had 2 people.
Got it.
1.5 roughly. So that's our size.
Thanks for that, Amy. I think it's going to be helpful for the attendees here. Can I kick it over to you, Eli?
Sure. Am I muted?
I think you might have been, but we can hear you now.
Okay, great. Try again. Morning, everyone. Eli Akira Kaufman. I'm the executive director of the LA County Bicycle Coalition. My pronouns are he, him, his. And the LA County Bicycle Coalition has been around for a little over 20 years, an advocacy group that's focused primarily on bicycling, although we recognize that we're part of the larger multimodal universe of Los Angeles, which includes pedestrians and transit, increasingly transit, which is a good sign. I've been in the position for a little over 1.5 years. Prior to LACBC, I worked at a place called River LA, which was all about reimagining the LA River, which, if you've seen any of the Terminator movies, is the trapezoidal concrete channel open sewer that the Terminator was blasting down in T2. To reimagine that space as a public amenity, as a transportation corridor, and as a place for folks to actually gather and be connected to their source of water. And speaking of which, I should also mention that I'm speaking to you from the nation of Tongva, which is our native community that was here before the rest of us arrived. So I want to sort of acknowledge that that's where I'm speaking to you from. LACBC does its work primarily through outreach, education, and advocacy. Outreach has been limited, obviously, due to COVID-19, but that had to do with organizing community rides, non-competitive community rides, to help folks that just in LA, right, the saying is nobody walks or rides, but actually that's very incorrect. There's a huge and growing number of folks who use walking and riding as their primary modes of transportation in combination with transit. And so we would organize these community events. Education-wise, we've had programs with our local school district, the second largest in the country, LAUSD, which has been in the news of quite a bit lately as well, doing bicycle education, safety programs, and like culture clubs to get kids engaged in cycling. And then we also have been working with the Safe Routes to School Coalition to try to find safer ways for folks to get to and from school, kids to get to and from school. LACBC's focus has been on safety as well, like Amy's organization. But I'm really excited for the conversation this morning because we recognize that we have to think about the definition of safety more broadly than against just vehicular violence. And so we're really kind of thinking about what safety actually means and for whom.
That's great. Hey, quick follow-up. In terms of the advocacy, are you focused, this is me having a naive question here, are you focused on like the city of LA, unincorporated LA, the many different towns, I guess? What's the focus?
And that's why we have that long name, the LA County Bicycle Coalition. So we are county-wide, so we're attempting to serve 10 plus million people. There's 107 cities, including unincorporated total. 15 councils. I mean, it's a huge area, as you all know. LA is a sprawling, massive urban area. So yeah, it's the entire county. And to be fair, answering the question, the follow-up question, we are currently a staff of 2.5. Wow. Yeah. But it's been a wild ride. So, and we can talk about that a little bit later.
Great. Okay. I'm looking forward to it. Okay, kicking over to you, Brian.
Good morning. Thanks, Vicky, and thank you, Cascade, for having me. My name is Brian Wiedenmeyer. I'm the Executive Director of the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition. I use he, him pronouns, and I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you this morning from Ohlone ancestral land here in San Francisco. The San Francisco Bicycle Coalition is a membership-based advocacy organization. We have over 10,000 members, 20 full-time staff, and our mission is to transform San Francisco's streets and neighborhoods into safe, just, and livable places by promoting the bicycle for everyday transportation. The main way we do that is really two thrusts of our work. One is organizing and advocacy work that really takes its shape on the streets of San Francisco, expanding our network of protected bike lanes, expanding car-free space and car light space across our city, fighting for policies locally that provide funding for active transportation, and improve the safety for everyone on our streets with a focus on bicycling. We also have a substantial program element that includes, as Eli mentioned, a youth and family biking program that focuses and works with our Safe Routes to School program here locally. We are San Francisco's largest provider of adult bicycle education, and we also do bike distribution through a variety of programs. Our Bike It Forward program, which refurbishes abandoned or unclaimed bicycles or donated bicycles and distributes them to folks who otherwise wouldn't have access. And our Bike Match program, which launched shortly after the COVID pandemic set in, that takes those same bicycles and matches them up with essential workers who need them for transportation.
Ooh, that's a lot. Thanks for that, Brian. I guess I'm really quick. So I'm playing like two roles here. I'm going to moderate, but then I also obviously want to share with the audience like what Cascade and Washington Bikes are up to. So a little bit of context about Cascade and Washington Bikes that I think is useful for this conversation. The two organizations merged in 2016. Cascade is celebrating its 50-year anniversary this year. Merged with Washington Bikes in 2016. That was a statewide organization, much younger, and and that took the two organizations kind of statewide. Under the Washington Bikes hat, we do advocacy in Olympia. October 1st marked the safety stop, the bikes being able to treat stop signs as a yield law that we really shepherded through in the 2020 legislative session this year. So that's the kind of stuff we do in Olympia, along with sort of funding work. We also, through that work, endorse political candidates for office. And then Cascade, really historically founded, like rooted in the Puget Sound region, which is the Seattle metro area, and focused on rides. Our big signature ride is the Seattle to Portland, which is such an asset in terms of bringing community together. We bring 10,000, typically on a typical year, 10,000 people ride STP, and it's a really important sort of revenue generator for our programming, both on the education and advocacy side. Obviously, we can get into the COVID piece in a second, but yeah, a lot of events, education in schools on a variety of forms, and then obviously our advocacy on the Cascade side is really rooted in sort of local government, traditionally sort of Seattle and other cities in the metro area. There's a lot more that I could say, but I won't. We have a staff currently of 23, so compared to like 1 to 2, it's like really big staff, but it was bigger a year ago. Again, we can talk about that in a sec. So I think, I think that intro kind of sets the stage for like who we all have in the room for this conversation. So thank you all. And then I think the context for this specific conversation, really that idea came out of talking on our team about things that we were hearing and seeing from our peer bike organizations, bike advocacy organizations, first in response to COVID and then in response to the Black Lives Matter protests this spring, which really shone a light in a sustained way on police brutality towards Black and brown people. And so the genesis of this conversation was to really kind of just talk about like how have these two huge shifts that we've seen in 2020, how have they impacted our work, and how do we see them impacting our work going forward? And so I think I want to start with sort of the COVID question of recognizing this is a lot to cover, hoping that you can each share how your organization has been responding to COVID, really with a focus on sort of like maybe the impacts initially and then like the external work that you've been doing. And I guess I'll start with Amy, if that's okay.
Sure. So I'm gonna answer the question, and if I fail to answer it entirely, feel free to ask again. And I go by she/her pronouns, by the way. So with regard to COVID, it affected our organization financially because we have, well, we're funded by membership, by bike clubs that have rides that also benefit us, as well as a separate ride that's not necessarily affiliated with a club, but it also benefits us too. We get license plate funds for a specialty bike plate, and anyway, we have a big membership program too. So COVID hit us with regard to those rides, and that has affected us big time. We've had to scale back. I have a child at home too, so that all of those things really reduced our capacity big time, probably by about almost 50%. So, had to just step back, reevaluate the budget, and really fine-tune things and figure out what really matters and what's really important and what's really working and what can work in the next year. And so that's been the biggest effects of COVID. Did I answer that question?
Yeah, totally. Okay, Eli.
Okay, cool. So we'll do the round robin. I'm trying to think about ways that COVID hasn't impacted LACBC. Like, are there ways that it hasn't impacted things for us? And it's pretty clear that it's pretty categorical for us. we had a staff of, I guess, 5 before COVID hit. And so now we're obviously a staff of 2.5. So that was an immediate impact. Like other coalitions, our revenue came from our contract work with LAUSD, LADOT, the Department of Transportation in our region, and LAUSD, as well as Metro. So and most of those things were in person: bike rides, bicycle training classes, classroom, trying to like get into public school classrooms as well. That was really the bread and butter of LACBC for a period. And so when everything got shut down, we were obviously shut down pretty heavily. In addition, we have rides like many coalitions as well. We're to celebrate the 20th annual LA River Ride, which is the largest community-based ride in Los Angeles. It's a really great, we have a ride for every level, from the peewees who are barely off of training wheels, all the way to the folks who are like pretty hardcore riders who can do a century without really breaking a sweat, and everything in between. And so that ride was also postponed. And we're hopeful that we'll be back in June in 2021, but that was also our major fundraiser. So it was a pretty big hit. But what COVID really did, beyond the financial burden that it created for us, and in a way, it really made us also consider what really matters. We created a series of what we call like rapid response programs. 2 in particular I'd like to share. One was we joined the national movement that Brian mentioned called Bike Match. I think it started initially in DC or New York, and then it sort of swept across the nation. And it was a great opportunity when a lot of folks were stuck at home, for them to look around and say, I've got that bike that's in my closet or in my garage. And it's a simple Google form where it's a 1-for-1 match. And so we participated in that bike match. Really felt like it was a great program to get bikes into the hands of those in need. And so we went out to some of our sponsoring organizations and asked if we could try to scale the program. And so Pure Cycles, which is a local Burbank bike company, and Warner Brothers, which is a global media company, came together and helped us put together a kind of a larger bike match build, socially or physically distanced. We built over 40 bikes in a week and made sure that they got into the hands of what we call anchor organizations throughout LA County that are doing direct service during the pandemic. For instance, the Tenants Union, which does tenants' rights advocacy against predatory landlords. They were having a hard time getting to the people, and so we wanted to make sure that we provided them with bikes. There's another environmental group called East Yards. We gave them 15 bikes. They're doing advocacy to make sure that folks who have lack of access to open space could still get families and kids to open space to just recreate and get some fresh air, among other programs that they run. So that's been a really fun thing that we were able to participate in. And the other thing we did was something called Bikes Mean Business, which we did with another partner organization up on Sunset Strip. In LA, there's a huge car culture here, and there's a huge fear of having your loss of parking spaces when we talk about bike infrastructure. And so what we wanted to do was go to those same businesses that were a little hesitant about supporting bike infrastructure and say, let's drive traffic, meaning business by bike and pedestrians we'd select a day, and we'd say, hey, everyone, let's show up at this spot on Sunset, and like, let's buy lunch or dinner throughout this day. Let's promote this one place and really support a local eatery. And it became a thing. We did it like 5 or 6 times, and we're able to draw attention to these businesses that were really struggling at that time. And so the Bikes Mean Business program is a way for us to show that bikes do mean business at the end of the day, and can provide those much needed patrons. So those are 2 sort of rapid response things. And I'll just wrap. I don't want to take up too much time, but so financially, it hurt the organization. It made us a little bit smarter about how we could have direct impact in our response to the pandemic. But the main thing I would say, and this is something I think everybody's feeling across the nation, regardless of what sector you're in, is that it really put into high relief in Los Angeles how inequity is really hurting Black and brown communities. We've known this in terms of lack of access to dignified education, housing. We have huge food deserts in Los Angeles. All of these issues that we've known about for decades have been exacerbated by the pandemic. And so it made us take a hard look at what our advocacy really needs to be about in terms of supporting the needs of people, and especially those folks who are most impacted, who happen to be our frontline workers or essential workers in LA, who happen to live in these massive apartment blocks with multi-generational families, who are all living in small, tight spaces without a lot of access to open space. And so, it's really made us do a gut check about, like, how do we need to show up for the communities most in need during this unprecedented time. So, and that kind of leads us into the BLM conversation from my perspective. But that's been a major sort of wake-up call for us.
Thanks for sharing all that, Eli. It's really interesting that you started the Bikes Main Business program in the pandemic. Like yeah, it's just really interesting to me because we've had a program like that, but in the past, and yeah, it just really speaks to responding to community need in a cool way. So thanks for sharing. Brian, can I kick this over to you?
Absolutely. Thanks for the question. I think that I'll start very in the immediate term as the pandemic set in, and as San Francisco was one of the first communities in the United States to have a shelter-in-place order. The first impacts were really operational and ensuring the safety and well-being and health of our team, our staff, and our members and our volunteers. So, shifting to remote work, figuring all those things out that we figured out 7 months ago. I think there were also immediate impacts to a lot of our programs. So things that were done in person obviously had to either shift to virtual, or in the case of our bicycle valet parking program. So we had a full-time staff person just managing that. We had contracts with the San Francisco Giants and the Golden State Warriors to do valet bike parking at our two major sporting venues here in San Francisco, Oracle Park and Chase Center Arena. Those, that revenue dried up pretty quickly, and those programs ceased to function as not just our own events, but events citywide and across the country were canceled, and people were not biking to events. So there was some immediate operational things that we were really focused on at the very beginning. And yes, and financially, as it became clear that not only were some of our contract revenue sources and our events, in-person events, which is a substantial chunk of our budget, but not as much maybe as some other organizations like Cascade. We don't do big fundraising rides, for instance. We do have 4 major events a year, but it's a version of a bike to work day, and then a few other in-person, more of your traditional gala or fundraising event. So the impact is there. I don't want to downplay that, but we are fortunate that we've been able to rely a bit more on membership dues, individual contributions, and somebody who was a nonprofit fundraiser during the last economic downturn in 2008, 2009. One of the lessons that I remember from that time was really chasing the opportunities where they became available. So government grants or funding programs, so making sure we got our PPP loan application in, as that was a high priority, and then really looking to private philanthropy for emergency support in the form of grants, and making sure we're cultivating our individual donors to ensure that they're continuing to support us generously. So we did have to lay off 2 staff people. So we were formerly at 22 FTE. And the one person who did manage our valet bike parking program, there just was no longer work for that person, was included in that. I would say as we tackled some of those operational concerns and ensured that we would have some financial sustainability moving forward, our attention also was on what this meant for our advocacy and what this meant for bike advocacy in general. I think 2 things became clear to me as the pandemic set in. One is that, for lack of a better term, the brand of bicycling was going to remain strong. It was a transportation choice and mode that responded well to the health constraints of this pandemic. But the other thing that struck me was that we started to get a lot of calls and input and feedback from our engaged membership, whether that was over email or more frequently over social media and bike Twitter in particular. And people were saying things like, we need to take advantage of this crisis. There's an opportunity, and every crisis presents an opportunity. And where are our car-free streets and our parks? Where are our slow streets programs? The drumbeat started pretty quickly for a more aggressive advocacy to restrict auto access to these spaces. And I really had to pause at that point, because what was clear to me is that, as Eli pointed out, there were many people in our community in San Francisco who were suffering from the health impacts of the pandemic, from the economic impacts. And the calls for people to say, there's an opportunity in this crisis, we need to take advantage of it, told me those people weren't experiencing a crisis. They were not, they had the time and energy to get on social media and really think about what a car-free street in Golden Gate Park, for example, would look like, and then call on us to organize and bang drum. And so there was this moment that I want to acknowledge, maybe April and through into early May, where we were really focused on making sure that we were listening to sound public health advice, following the advice of experts, trying to figure out, but really the health and wellness of our own staff, and how we could best support our community partners, and had to pause and I think really stop doing that advocacy work. And I think for our staff and for our members, for some of them, that was a jarring experience, because this is the thing we're designed to do. It's in our mission. We're built to do this. But the other thing that's in our mission is this word just, and thinking about what justice means in our community. And so what I did with our board is adapt our strategic plan, which has a set of values and goals, to a 6-month vision and action strategy, which really focused on a few key points that would guide our work kind of over this next 5 to 6 months, whenever that was, to achieving goals that were aligned with our strategic plan goals and objectives, but took into account the extraordinary circumstances we were in. So I think we're kind of now moving out of that phase and beginning to look at what does adapting that plan to recovery look like. But we can talk about that further in the panel as well.
That's a lot. That's super interesting. And there was a lot in that. I think I appreciate you brought the idea of a pause in there, because I think that's something that we experience. Like I think Cascade experienced a lot of what you're all talking about in terms of like revenue loss, scaling back, but especially on the advocacy side, I think so much of what I do and what my team does, like there's just so much momentum behind what we're doing, that we're just being pushed forward in a great way. And I think what I experienced in kind of bringing these two things together, the COVID and then the Black Lives Matter protests, I think that COVID created a pause in our work that as the BLM protests really kind of took all the space in the room, and a lot of, I think, voices that I tremendously respect, like Black voices in the bike community. I'm thinking of Tamika Butler, I'm thinking of Charles Brown, who was our keynote the other day, really were asking questions, very pointed questions of the bike community. And I think I really had to take like the pause really enabled me and really pushed me. I should acknowledge that it wasn't enabled me, it pushed me, right, to kind of say, what are we doing wrong, and who are we not including in our advocacy in a sustained way, where I think we sort of proudly pat ourselves on the back as an organization for having Black keynote speakers at our summit and in the past few years, but really, I'll own this myself, really hadn't done the work of fully listening to what they were saying and to how the work needed to transition. And so I think that beyond all of the challenging things that COVID has created for everyone and for our organization, I think that is the kind of 1-2 that I'm really kind of grateful that we had the space to pause and think about what was really being said and what that really means for us as an organization. I think we have been halting in our work around racial equity for the last several years. We've had a plan in the works, but again, the momentum of a million different things pushing us forward, and not necessarily the sustained capacity to really finish that plan, which is really just like step one, right? Because then you need to implement the plan. And so it's been really interesting to have that be another kind of interjection into the mix of like, oh, now we have a racial equity plan. Now we really have like a plan that is a roadmap for us to move forward. And I think just for myself, I'm not going to speak for all of my team, right? Just a really sustained and new understanding of the importance of this work to really reflect Black and Brown community needs in mobility. That was a lot of me talking, maybe in an incoherent way. And so I think that kind of leads us to kind of the next piece of how your organization has responded then to the Black Lives Matter protests, and what your organization's initial response was. I have a million questions here. And then how that work is maybe changing your organization in a sustained way, and maybe how it's building on work that you were already doing around racial equity in biking. And I'm going to open it up to whomever wants to answer that question.
Would you mind, Vicky, if I jumped in here quickly? And this is something that I want to start by saying that I want to acknowledge a mostly white panel talking about the impact of Black Lives Matter on our movement. And I know Vicky and you and staff at Cascade and I talked about representation on this panel being important, and in focusing on leadership of bike advocacy organizations, also want to acknowledge the extreme whiteness of that group of people, and being reflective of, I think, the whiteness of our movement. And I can speak for the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition in saying certainly the whiteness of our membership and the overrepresentation of white folks in our membership, and how that reverberates and shows up in our organization's cultures and in leadership. And I do want to start maybe from more of a personal point of view in responding to that question. I think, for me personally, as a leader of an organization and a bike advocacy organization, in May, after the murder of George Floyd and the ensuing protest movement and kind of the national reckoning around race, as a white person who had worked in social justice spaces before coming to the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition, somebody that maybe considered myself pretty woke, thought I had done a lot of work on this topic, and that I was, very, very fluent in talking about racial justice and anti-Blackness in our community and in our work. And I think, like a lot of other organizations in the wake of the protests in Minneapolis, a city which I lived in and love very much, by the way, there was an internal conversation about, do we put out a statement? What does the statement mean? And how do we respond? And I think I was caught off guard by my own desire to respond, and this kind of need that I felt within myself that we have to say something. And I want to thank the folks of color on my staff, my Black and Brown staff in particular, for calling me out in that moment, and having a really difficult conversation about, wait, why are we saying something right now when we didn't say anything about the dozens of Black folks who were killed by police in this country in the year previous? Why, what is our authority to speak on this matter? What are we saying versus what are we doing? And as a white leader in this space, it did cause me to, to pause again. We're talking about pausing, and do some deep reflection and work that was not easy, that was painful, that was acknowledging ways in which I had personally caused harm, ways in which my leadership had impacted Black and Brown folks on our staff, in our membership, in our community. And then really, kind of then force this additional reckoning of what is the role of leadership in this moment of largely white organizations when it comes to racial justice and when it comes to addressing anti-Blackness in our movement and within our own organization. And so that became a much longer process, and beyond just the statement, it did lead to a letter that I wrote openly to our membership, trying to address white supremacy in our movement and within our organization. And it led to difficult conversations, largely with other white folks who, some of whom have been members and donors for a long time, some who are newer to our organization, but really, figuring out what was my role as a white leader, in particular in talking to other white folks within our organization and having that conversation about, this is what our work means. And if we really want to say we believe in justice and transportation justice, if that's one of our values, this is what it looks like. And it means saying no to some of the things you're asking for. It means, listening first. It means showing up for other communities before leading with our own idea or solution. And it means sometimes not talking about the bike. And I think, the bicycle is a beautiful tool, but it's a means to an end. It's not an end unto itself. And so when we talk about bicycling as a vehicle for, or a way to move towards social justice and anti-racism, sometimes that takes a form that I think a lot of our white members are not comfortable or familiar with talking about. And so that's, there's been open tension on that front, and we've lost members because of that conversation. And we still have a ways to go. I don't want to just, in closing my remarks on this for the moment, I don't want to present this like we have solved this issue, or this is ongoing work, obviously. It's ongoing work for me as a leader, and it's ongoing work across our organization. And even for an organization that had set up on our staff, for instance, separate caucuses of folks of color and white allies to do racial justice work, before, this is, a year and a half ago, that had, put transportation justice as a value in our strategic plan, that had tried to incorporate equity, however you define that word, in our work. We were not where we needed to be to speak with authority in that moment. And so that was a lesson for me personally, and I think it's been a lesson for our staff and our board and our members.
Thanks for sharing that, Brian. I really appreciate it. I mean, it's really interesting to just, get a window into, like, I saw your open letter to your membership. And so just seeing a window into, behind that, right, is really fascinating and food for thought. Okay, Eli and Amy, I want to open this up for you.
I'm happy to jump in, but Amy, I don't want to sort of go too fast. So
Go ahead, Eli. Sounds good.
Yeah, I mean, I really, first of all, I want to thank Brian for his letter, and I think I thanked him personally when he sent it back when it first went out. I think, it showed a level of awareness and an openness to not knowing or unknowing that was really brave. So I just want to say that. So thank you, Brian. From my perspective, and I'm there's so many things to think about. So for LACBC, you mentioned Tamika Butler. She was the executive director of LACBC for about 3.5 years, and really was way ahead of this whole conversation around placing equity at the center of our work, and was already talking about white supremacy and the issues around the type of privilege that oppresses others, and specifically Black and brown communities. And she met a lot of resistance from the bicycling community in Los Angeles, and essentially paid a pretty high price, personally and also professionally. And so when I was looking at joining the organization 1.5 years ago, we had some pretty serious conversations about just about what the status of the cycling movement was in Los Angeles, and what the possibility was. And something that she's been saying a lot recently, which I take to heart, is the difference between sort of performative actions, like letters of solidarity, which we definitely put out there, versus like direct action, things that are actually that have more consequence, that require more sacrifice. And specifically this difference between what an ally is versus what an accomplice is, which I think is a really important thing to talk about here. So I'll just sort of get into it just briefly. An ally is somebody who agrees with you tacitly sends you the text, hey, good job, thank you for speaking the truth, thank you for being vulnerable, thank you for being you, but not really taking any action in the moment. Whereas an accomplice, the other sort of level, is somebody who doesn't wait till after the fact, but actually acts and responds more immediately and more directly and takes direct action. So instead of saying, yeah, we got to work on it, we've got a plan, here's our strategy, it's about like, what's the doing that can happen? And that takes a level of courage, it takes a level of capacity, both personally and organizationally, to be able to make those types of changes. And so I think what we're trying to do is figure out, how do we move past the performative kind of being an ally to the more we're accomplices in the change that we all recognize will make our streets ultimately safer, more equitable, healthier for everyone. And it's hard. And I'm you know, I'll be the first to share that, like, there was the similar pushback that Brian's talking about in San Francisco. We did a special message every Friday for a period, and we lost people for sure. We lost donors, we lost some members who just wanted us to talk about, you know, just talk about riding bikes. This is a great opportunity for all of us in LA to enjoy cleaner air, because there was less traffic, especially those first early months. And this was before the George Floyd murder. And so, like, there was this window of opportunity where everyone was like, let's take advantage and let's just get out and ride. And can this be the respite from these more complicated, more challenging, more complex conversations? And I think the easier path would have been for us to sort of like double down on the bikiness of things. But we've taken a different course, and a lot of that has to do with internal work that we're doing with our own board. And it has to do with our internal work that the staff is working on as well, to live up to actually making our streets safer for everyone, so that folks who are riding while Black and brown are protected and supported in ways that are meaningful. And so that's a much higher bar to reach, and something that takes more than a statement of solidarity. So we recognize we have a ways to go as well, and sort of understanding where we're showing up as an ally versus an accomplice that can really make change.
Thanks, Eli. Amy, I'm gonna kick over to you.
Thanks, Eli, for that really interesting. That these are. It's been helpful to really get a chance to hear you guys first, because there's definitely a lot going on at the state level and also the local level, and the fabric of those contexts, I think, really provides some unique situations. So in South Carolina, at the state level, we were dealing with equity issues for a long time. And our state is 28% Black, 45% of our bike and ped injuries and fatalities were African American. And so these issues have really been with us for a really long time. I think one thing I want to mention is that our South Carolina is actually half the size of LA County, which is kind of crazy to think about, that our state is so small. But so there's really so much to talk about. My brain is about to explode on this, but within the state legislature, we were dealing with this for years, because anytime we tried to move forward with any sort of enforcement related law change of any type, we got a lot of pushback, and finally, you know, so the whole thing has really been substantive for us for a long time. And there's a lot of very, very strong Black American legislators in South Carolina. And so we've been having these conversations for a long time anyway, about just the need for criminal justice reform before any type of additional enforcement regulations are passed. And so we modified our legislative agenda accordingly a few years ago. And in fact, one of the hardest legislative initiatives to push in our state, we still don't have a hands-free distracted driving bill. We don't have a hands-free law yet, and so we're still trying to move forward with that. And before George Floyd, so in February 2020, we pulled a law from Massachusetts that was successful in 2019 that it wouldn't have passed unless it had this criminal justice reform element to it. And so we were trying to move forward with that pre-pandemic, pre-George Floyd, as a lever to get hands-free passed, but to make sure that it would not be inequitably enforced. And so then the pandemic hit. My kid comes home from daycare, and all of a sudden, all the capacity is really drawn back. And so, to be honest, the performative aspect of making your position understood to your members and to the public at large actually never happened because I didn't have time. I did manage to throw a lot of stuff out there through social media and just by sharing links and through our email. And so I did receive some of the conversation about it, and similar to a lot of you guys, I'm sure I lost some members. I know I did. One person explicitly told me that. But who cares? It's one membership, and fundraising is a fluid thing that you always have to reevaluate, and so that doesn't matter. So legislatively, we have been, and we are, and we do continue to reevaluate what we're moving forward with. And the interesting thing about the Black Lives Matter movement, the 2020 version of it, is that it really opened up the doors to adding more partners for us in that. And so previous to 2020, we were having conversations with urban leagues across the state, with NAACP. And so now with the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement, we've got some additional leadership that has emerged to where we can have conversations. So our capacity is starting to inch back up. And so we're really trying to have more of that conversation. I have yet to really get my board and my entire organization and the strategic plan, the mission and the vision and everything aligned with the work that we already are doing towards equity. But I think that's going to come in due time. When we have such a small organization, I think that, when I started out saying that we really had to evaluate what's important right now, the important thing is that the work continue, and that we continue to really do the work that includes the justice movement as well. And so outside of legislation, one thing I want to mention is that we also have a complete streets policy that we're trying to move forward. So with regards to infrastructure, and so at the statewide level, things are really ramping up now. We have been in the middle of a state complete streets policy campaign for almost 3 to 4 years, actually since 2017, which is an insanely long time. But we did have the benefit of having a lot of guidance and some capacity from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, who has equity at the core of what they do. And so I was able to, a few years ago, hire an equity consultant to really help engage with as many partners as we possibly could, and to really take the time to develop a really good policy proposal. We are getting pushback from that. We just got word yesterday from our Secretary of Transportation for a lot of different reasons, but the fact that 45% of our bike and pedestrian injuries and fatalities are Black Americans is huge to us. And so if we don't have equity at the core, we're really not doing the job of passing a good policy. So that equity component is just passing good policy. And one thing I want to mention is just that, if anyone has any doubts about this, the data supports it. it's just, it's, you know, it comes down to values and intent, and that also comes down to, on the other side of that same coin, is really looking at the numbers and making sure that people understand that this is a big part of it. So I know, you know, we do biking because we know that that is a fundraising source, but walking and pedestrian fatalities are, and injuries, and the safety aspect of pedestrianism and is something that on a statewide level, I think is critical, because there's a lot of locally grown movements where the bike community is leading it, right? And what is the bike community? It's a social entity. It's part of the culture of occupying public space, but also, you know, everyone is a pedestrian, and that's not something that comes with identity politics, but it is something that what we're finding is that there are, from a statewide perspective, there's gaps. There's rural areas with tiny little small towns with huge pedestrian fatality problems, but it's not on anyone's radar. And so I think the number we pulled the other day is that 1/3 of South Carolina's pedestrian injuries and fatalities are in rural areas that have no MPO that is watching out or receiving these planning funds to really focus on it, hire, you know, any kind of consultant to create a master plan or anything like that. And so this is something that we're currently really trying to pull out, you know, trying to get a coalition and every partner that we have on this, including the new ones from 2020. And we're really, really trying to make sure that this is something that we pass a policy that where these areas of greatest need are really taken care of first. And so that's a critical piece. The last thing I want to mention is engagement. And just that we had one example. There was a buffered bike lane that was put in a year or two ago in a community color in Columbia, South Carolina, in our state capital. And no engagement occurred before this brand new NACTO style bike lane went in. And there was so much community backlash that the entire project was repaved and redone. It was a road diet with a buffered bike lane. People of color were in this neighborhood reacted so strongly that it was a reckoning that the bike community had to deal with. And so I just, you know, that was a really good case study, just in the absolute importance of engagement over any type of enforcement. So, but it's also a critical piece that it's about people, right? It's not about infrastructure. It's about people in those spaces, and about thinking about spaces not just as the in-between from A to B, but from the space itself, of utilizing that space and not, you know, disproportionately impacting folks in our central areas.
Thanks, Amy. Thank you. A lot in there. I think when we were doing our prep call, I was really interested in the legislation around adding criminal justice reform as a component instead of, you know, just adding tickets for things that can be disproportionately, you know, distributed, and certainly are. So that's really interesting work. I've let time run away with this because this was just such a good conversation, and I think, you know, we have a minute, and I know that I think a lot of the questions have really kind of been teed in the conversation that we just had, but I think one question that just popped up that I do want to give a second to, if everyone is good to like stay for a couple more minutes. I'm going to see if people are willing to nod. Yeah. How is your organization showing up to support existing BIPOC-led coalitions for racial justice? How do you evaluate starting a new initiative versus engaging with long-term organizing around something like decriminalization? Great question. And I'm going to open it up to whomever.
I'll volunteer to go first and be quick about this. I think what I was saying first previously about learning how to listen first and listen to leadership, in particular from Black voices in our community when it comes to issues of policing, when it comes to issues around justice and equity in transportation spaces has been really important. And so again, this is that tension between needing to go through a planning process and engaging in action and supporting an action in the community. And again, what I heard loud and clear, and particularly from my staff of color, was we don't need a plan right now. This is not the time for planning. We have things we want you to do. And yes, there's some internal things, and we didn't talk about kind of the career pathways and all the other things that this reckoning has brought about internally for our staff and for many other nonprofit organizations, I think. But when it came to our advocacy work in the community, it has been about taking a back seat, about joining movements and organizing that's already in progress. Looking to defund SFPD Now leadership for to take our cues for what we're going to be talking about when it comes to policing and traffic enforcement and policing and bike theft, and taking our cues when it comes to budget priorities for the city from Black leaders and Black folks in the community who have been doing this organizing work, and amplifying those voices instead of putting out our own statement or coming up with our own plan, using the privilege and power that we have accumulated to signal boost what others in our community are already saying.
Thanks. Okay, so I want to do a really quick wrap up, really quick round robin question. And if you also feel so called to speak to the last question, I invite you to wrap that in. But my last question to everyone, rapid fire, is: what are the next steps for your organization? What do you think success will look like? And how will we know, this is a big question, how will we know as a bike community when the work is being done?
Well, can I just jump in? I mean, I was for LACBC, I really take, I'm aligned and resonate with what Brian was saying about needing to listen carefully to organizations that are being led, that have equity at their core. We are a bike advocacy organization, and while we're finding it's just impossible to separate mobility justice from social justice, racial justice. We need to make sure that we're taking our cues from folks who are most deeply impacted by the lived experience, I think is what Brian's been saying, and taking our cues from those leaders. And that's something that bike advocates, let's be honest, have a hard time doing, because as a community, we feel on the street that we are a second class citizens. And so it's a very easy thing to conflate being, a cyclist who feels that they are not given the same rights and privileges and safety as cars, to not take on a cause that feels very much, the same. But it's not the same experience, because you can always get off your bike. And I think that's something that that's been a lesson for us to learn, that in spite of the fact that we feel that we resonate with feeling like we are getting, that there's inequity in the streetscape, it's not the same experience exactly. So that's something that's been just sort of like a learning. In terms of like our next action steps, just quickly, we recognize that our board composition needs to be addressed. It reflects the bike advocacy movement in Los Angeles. So in that way, it's like pretty aligned. At the same time, it doesn't represent the county that we're meant to serve. And so we recognize that we have to work extra hard to address that composition of the board. Our staff is very diverse, what there is of it. And so we always will make sure that we make that a priority to have the staff also reflect the communities we serve. But there's a board composition issue that we're talking about. We are also looking to do some some equity and anti-racism training. There was a resolution that the board just passed to really ask for help, which I thought was a great indicator that we can't, while we can't lead this conversation, we can't just sit back and watch from the sidelines. So we're doing that internal work as well. And then I'd say the final thing is, in Los Angeles, a lot of the issues that are that we're suffering from the most are connected to lack of access to the services, the education, the open space, that actually perpetuates the inequities that these communities are suffering from the most. And so, in a way, the thing that we can do the most is to continue to carry on with the work we're doing to narrow those gaps, especially in those communities that are most impacted. And so it's like, it's keeping our eye on the ball of why we're here as bicycle advocates and as active transportation advocates, as we absorb and listen and take cues from the communities that are actually leading this movement and should be leading this movement, like Black Lives Matter and some of the other mobility or social justice organizations that we've been learning from.
Thanks. Amy, how about I kick this over to you and then we'll have Brian wrap up with future.
So our next steps, well, I guess my next step, because my board is gonna be the next one after this, but my next step is really to make sure that I have got input and direction from our partners of color who have lots of opinions about policy and how campaigns are run, but we've got to fully integrate all of these opinions into the policies that we're passing, and down to, fully edits. And then at some point, I hope, what does success look like? Success means having folks of color on our staff. So that is, that's what success looks like ultimately. I've got to get our funding in better shape to get to that point. But the immediate step would be having our policies really completely modified and our campaigns modified. I mean, South Carolina has a huge civil rights movement history, and so there's a lot of leadership here that there's really a lot going on. But having our policies and campaigns fully changed by these folks that we already know is really a key thing. And then the next step would really be getting my at this point all white board into a more diverse, but that and then also having everybody really having our strategic direction and having plans in place, really, so that even after my time here, that kind of thing remains, and that there's some longevity to it. And really ultimately making sure that we don't just that the planning processes, one thing that really worries me is just that the local planning processes across our state are not fully inclusive of really authentic engagement methods. So that's something that it is really a tough nut to crack, but it's something that I think is a long-term goal to really work on. So that's where I'm coming from.
Let's do it, Brian.
And quickly, I think what's next for our organization and our work, and what does success look like? In the immediate term, we are looking at increasing our work around this idea of removing enforcement from kind of all aspects and dimensions of road safety, and not just reform of Vision Zero policies, but that extends to bicycle theft, which is a hot topic in San Francisco. And really, recognizing that traffic enforcement is probably the largest space where Black folks experience bias and harassment and violence from law enforcement. That there is no world in which we can, with good faith and conscience and being an organization that claims to be anti-racist, support law enforcement as part of that strategy. And so really looking at, I think, a fundamental rethinking of how traffic enforcement fits into this overall idea of safety and safety for whom, and how we can be innovative in piloting alternatives to police-based enforcement, and not just automated enforcement, because I don't feel like automated enforcement is a panacea. It can be part of a toolkit, but really, again, listening to community and using our expertise, you know, kind of figuring what do we have to show up to in this conversation that we can contribute positively. And I think that really does come, and what we're hearing from elected officials, from folks in the community is, yes, we want you to be a part of this conversation around traffic enforcement and how we can reform it. So that's in the immediate term. I think medium to longer term, what does recovery look like? I think somebody in the chat said something about, you know, when COVID is over and, you know, there's going to be a vaccine maybe in June of next year, and magically we'll go back to our old way of doing things. And I agree that with the assessment of that commenter that it's not going to be the case. This is going to be a recovery, a health recovery, an economic recovery, a cultural and political recovery that stretches months and years. And so transportation recovery, and looking at San Francisco's transportation recovery plan, how do we, as advocates for biking and as advocates for, you know, as I said, as part of our mission, transforming our city into a safe, just, and livable place, what role do we play in that recovery? How do we partner with the small businesses? How do we ensure that, you know, there is a worst case scenario where transit is starved for funding and customers, and you know, the negative impacts that come with single occupancy auto trips are really on the rise as part of this recovery. So how do we, in an authentic way that's aligned with those values I've been talking about, support that recovery to make sure that people who can and are able to and want to bike are able to?
Thank you, Brian. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to our audience who, we couldn't be here if you weren't here. I mean, I guess we could be chatting. I know that we, our panelists are incredibly busy, and so I want to set you free for the rest of your days, and our audience too. But thank you. This conversation, I got a lot out of this conversation. I hope that it was a good conversation for you all too, and the audience. And yeah, I just really want to thank you for your time and your thoughts. And good luck in this work moving forward, and you know, making the difference that I think we all want to continue to make and make more. So thank you all. Bye.